Hi, how's it going? I'm Pirate the Fool. Welcome to my channel. Okay, so not gonna lie, I was originally going to make a video about being dyslexic, but I had so many issues trying to record that video and I kind of just burned out on trying to record that one. So we're going to talk about a topic that I've been wanting to talk about for the longest time. It has been burning in the back of my mind, and this mostly has stemmed from I used to be a huge fan of Shadiversity. I liked his videos. I liked how he talked about like medieval stuff and fantasy and kind of like throwing in a little bit of logic, because I personally like to throw in a little bit of logic into my fantasy stuff too. I like seeing people add rules to a world and working with those rules to create a good story. However, Shadiversity unfortunately recently has been saying some things that have just genuinely pissed me off. The last video of his I watched was a video where he was talking about women in action and his opinions on women in action. And I'm not gonna lie, I didn't finish the video because I just got so peeved by all of the points he was making that, I just couldn't finish it. I was just so peeved. The video is going to focus on Shadiversity's opinions on women in action and how he largely thinks that women should simply not be in action, and how I strongly disagree. It always annoys me that this conversation tends to be had when it's just like a group of guys like talking about their opinions of seeing women on screen in action, and it's kind of clear that they haven't really talked to any of the women in their life about this particular subject, so it's just their opinions. So as a woman who enjoys action and also enjoys to write action, I'm going to give my 2 cents on the topic. I'm currently working on a graphic novel series that centers around a team of women superheroes. No, it's not a magic girl graphic novel. I'm offended that you asked. You can have a team of female superheroes. That's not a magic girl, okay? The character you can see me drawing here is actually one of my characters from this particular series. But without much else to say, let's jump right into this thing. Alright, so the first point that I wanted to talk about is the argument of I don't want feminist messaging in my movies. I want to keep my movies and media clean, pure from any political messaging. Get that out of there. Which honestly, I think that's a fair point. It can be a little frustrating sometimes when you just want to watch something that's, just like some eye candy, something fun, and then all of a sudden, feminism suddenly showing up, politics. But I do get a little frustrated when people consider having a specific type of character a political message. That frustrates me to no end. Why is certain characters a message, like a female character being an action hero is somehow a political message instead of just a fun character that we can enjoy? Or like people complaining about people of color being in their media. Like a lot of people make fun of the new Alan Wake game, calling it Alan Woke because one of the main characters is a black woman, which, oh my gosh, how terrible. That was obviously sarcasm. Please take that as sarcasm. Anyways, what I'm trying to say is saying that someone being a specific gender or race or sexuality, that means that's a political message, I think is inherently false. Unless like the movie is specifically, or the show is specifically highlighting like a struggle this person goes through that tends to be political. It's not political, okay? You just don't want to see women and people of color or people of different sexualities in your media, and it's okay to just be honest with yourself. If that's not something you want to watch, I'm going to probably not like you very much if you are honest with yourself and not liking that kind of thing. But I think we shouldn't try to say that's inherently political. But I will admit, I think that political messaging in media can be done right. We can look at the classic example of Avatar: The Last Airbender, the animated TV show, one of the best animated TV shows to have ever been made. In that show, there are lots of quote-unquote political messages, especially in the first season. There's the Kyoshi Island episode where Sokka thinks that he could definitely beat up the Kyoshi warriors and he's so cool and awesome because he's a dude, and then he gets his butt absolutely handed to him and he realizes that, hey, you know, these women have more training than I do, and so therefore I have something to learn from them if I can just humble myself to admit that I am weaker than a woman at this particular point in time. And then later on in the season, there's the ending where Katara is wanting to learn waterbending for the purposes of combat. However, in the Northern Water Tribe, women are not allowed to learn combat waterbending techniques, basically, and she fights for that right. But the thing is the way that The Last Airbender handles these feminist messages don't feel like they're shoving women are so cool down your throat. They're more of just pointing out like these assumptions, these general attitudes towards women that aren't inherently wrong. They're not trying to put down men in order to make these women feel better. I mean, for Pete's sake, Katara, in order to be allowed to learn waterbending for the purpose of fighting, she has to fight the master of waterbending that she wants to learn from. And she doesn't win the fight. She puts up a pretty good fight, but she doesn't end up winning the fight because that doesn't make any sense. She has barely spent any time learning to properly waterbend, so she does not have the skill or technique. However, she does learn and gain skill and becomes amazing by the end of the show. That is actually a feminist message, but it's written in a way that is actually good and you actually want to watch this. But we can look at something that has a feminist message that is written poorly. I think that the DC TV shows, specifically the Superwoman show and apparently the Batwoman show, has, well, just generally like left-leaning politics, which is fine, but the way that they're written is just so awful that even left-leaning people are just like, this is horrible, I don't want to watch this. They spoon feed it to you. Like the classic line that so many people love to quote of, and I'll paraphrase because I'm not going to look it up, in the Batwoman show where Batwoman is just like, the suit hasn't been made properly until it's made for a woman. Which, yeah, that's stupid. That's a stupid thing to say. Because it's implying that in order for a woman to be powerful, she has to put down her male counterparts. That she has to replace them instead of working with them. Or just being her own thing. I think if you want to make some amazing feminist message that isn't shoehorned, you know, instead of taking a character and just turning them into a female version of them, which is always going to result in them being seen as a female version of their male counterpart, which Superwoman or Supergirl, I don't know why they call her Supergirl, I think that's stupid. They should call her Superwoman, which I get Superwoman is a different character or whatever, but DC's canon is all over the place. They could have gotten away with saying she was Superwoman instead of Supergirl, but it's fine. Why not, instead of always making them a female version of the male counterparts, which then means that they're always going to be in opposition, they're always going to be in competition to their male counterparts, why not make them their own superhero? Like Wonder Woman is her own thing. There's no male version of Wonder Woman. She's just her own character. I think that's all I wanted to talk about with that. So to sum up this little chunk, basically, you don't hate feminist messaging unless you're anti-feminist, of course. You dislike bad writing. Someone else has said this in a video. I'm just repeating it. It's just bad writing that you are hating, not the feminist messaging. Unless you hated The Last Airbender because of the Kyoshi Island episode and the Katara storyline, which, well, you can go eat a lemon, frankly. Okay, next point. I'm pretty sure this video is probably going to piss a few people off, which honestly is fine. I mean, a bunch of guys talking about this subject has pissed me off, so time time to return the favor, I suppose. The next point that Shad made in his video was that women are weaker than men. Like, this is an inherent fact, not just like a typical occurrence. This is actually not a fact. I say this isn't true because there are outlying situations where women are stronger than men. Like, say, a female bodybuilder is up against a guy who sits on his butt playing video games all day and is a weak little noodle. I bet you that in like an arm wrestling competition or something like that, the bodybuilder woman will probably win against that guy. And then you also think about an adult woman up against, say, a teenage boy that is a female being stronger than a male. And a lot of the time, men being stronger than women tends to be after puberty, largely before puberty. Male and female children tend to be very similar in their physical abilities and their strength level, realistically. So this is not an inherent fact, okay? Women being weaker than men is not an inherent fact. It does tend to be true most of the time, but it is not inherently true all of the time, therefore it cannot be stated as a fact. The next little bit, I don't remember if Shad made this argument in his video, but I have heard this argument in other videos and just in general, and I just kind of wanted to counter it really quickly. A lot of guys seem to think that women can't really handle pain, that we're just like a bunch of little weaklings who can't handle pain and anything scary happening, which, like, even from a scientific mind, that thought process doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, considering when women deal with periods on a regular basis, the vast majority of us deal with a bit of pain during our time of the month. Even though I guess a lot of men who think that women can't handle pain would argue that we're just being a bunch of little wimps, which I'd like to see you handle cramps every month. And on top of that, women still choose to have lots of babies despite the pain of childbirth. I mean, if childbirth wasn't really that painful, why would we have invented ways to reduce that level of pain or remove it completely if it wasn't really that bad, you know? Childbirth is also incredibly dangerous, and I know not every woman will necessarily face childbirth, and not every woman will necessarily have a period or a painful period, but it is still a general, like, most women will, even if not all will, if that makes sense. Alright, so as somewhat of a continuation of the previous point, one of Shadiversity's points that really got on my nerves was that if a woman sees another woman on screen performing some epic action thing, beating a bunch of dudes up and being epic like that, that the real life person watching that woman will think that she can do the same. He was kind of talking about this point as there's a rise in videos of women trying to hit men, trying to get into fist fights with men, and his logic was that this is happening because we are seeing more women in action, more women beating up large groups of men. Yeah, he was saying that seeing other women doing this is what's leading to this phenomenon, even though there's more videos of literally everything right now because everybody has a video recorder in their pocket. Anyone can take a picture, anyone can take audio, anyone can take videos whenever the fetch that they want to, which means I'm sure that women did pick fights with men in the past, but they weren't always caught on a camera necessarily. And now it can be easily caught on a camera. But that aside, I find it kind of insulting that Shad thinks that women need to be told and reminded constantly that we're little weaklings and that we can't handle a fight against men and that we can't tell the difference between fiction and reality. Like, I'm sorry, that is ridiculous. Because if we're going to apply that logic, then a man seeing one guy beating up like 20 dudes should also not be allowed to be shown in media, because then that guy is going to think think that he could beat up 10 men too, you know? Which, like, unless you have some crazy training, no, you cannot. Because honestly, with that logic, then realistically, Daredevil shouldn't be allowed to exist, because Daredevil is literally a blind man who is capable of beating up rooms full of people. Though that scene from the TV show, the Wonder scene from Daredevil is definitely one of my favorite scenes. What I'm trying to say is that if we're going to apply this logic of people seeing action heroes being cool action heroes makes them think that they can be cool action heroes in real life too, we should apply it to everybody, not just women, okay? We're not a bunch of dumb sacks of rocks that can't tell the difference between fiction and reality. I'm like, come on, man. But yeah, a woman putting herself into a dangerous scenario where she can be harmed by a man, say. Like, I think it's also a bit victim blamey to say that it's the woman's fault if something bad happens to her, because like I was saying before, it's not a fact, but it is a norm that women tend to be weaker than men. And so with that factor and that thought in mind, then men should keep that in mind when they are handling a woman. So a woman, like, say, punching a man in the face does not mean that he gets to use his full force and his full strength back against this woman, because he knows that he could hurt her and he knows that he shouldn't, and therefore if he does, that's on him. Okay, I don't want to infantilize women, but the best analogy I can think of is if a child decides to come up to you and punch you in the stomach, you're not gonna like hit that kid as hard as friggin' possible, right? You're not even gonna hit the kid. You're going to either like remove yourself from the situation or try to kind of like restrain the kid if they are having like some big fit where they could potentially hurt themselves or somebody else. It's the same thing. I'm sorry. All in all, if you're fighting against somebody who you know is physically weaker than you and you pose a massive advantage against that person, it is your job to temper your strength, not the other person to know that you're not going to snap and absolutely harm them in a serious way. That is your job, to temper your strength and watch yourself, okay? Returning back to the videos that Shad has likely seen of women attempting to fight men and it ending really poorly for her, I think he seems to forget that, and him thinking that this is because she saw an action hero do this. No, I don't think she's trying to replicate anyone, if I'm being totally honest. I think that Shad is seeming to forget that women can be equally aggressive to men. Like, women have testosterone naturally in them, and thus they will be prone to violence at times, especially if they feel threatened, if someone pisses them off, if like, just like the normal level as men. And so I think it's also unfair for a man who basically makes it seem like as a man it's totally fine for you to get yourself into these kinds of situations, that like it's not fair that for you to say that men can just let loose, but women have to watch themselves, and if they don't watch themselves and they get themselves hurt, that is their fault. You know, that is completely unfair. All right. So basically what I'm trying to say is please stop infantilizing women, thinking that we're too dumb to tell the difference between fiction and reality, and learn to control yourself better. I did forget to add the tiny disclaimer here of course, if you decide to create a violent situation, that you are somewhat responsible for what happens, but to say that they are completely responsible for what happened isn't entirely fair either. It takes two to tango, so let's make sure that both parties are blamed for the situation. What I'm trying to say is that women have just as much of a right to put themselves into stupid, dangerous situations as men do. But realistically, like, nobody should be putting themselves into dangerous situations, period, end of story. And realistically, I don't understand why we are focusing specifically on women putting themselves into dangerous situations like this. Continuing forward, shall we? Another point that Shad made in his video is that action doesn't appeal to women as much as it appeals to men. There is not as much of an audience of women compared to men, which, yeah, that is largely true. But I don't think that's because women don't enjoy action. I personally believe that that is because action is rarely made to appeal to women. I mean, when we watch media, we tend to liken ourselves or put ourselves into the shoes of the character that resembles us the closest. And so in an action movie, when the only representation of a female character is this wimpy little marshmallow, you can imagine that, most women aren't going to relate to that. Like, I sure as heck don't. I find it frankly annoying when the female character doesn't help out when there's a big combat situation. That drives me absolutely insane. Like, I can understand if, maybe she doesn't have the right training, but, it still doesn't make it super interesting to me. And those movies, a lot of action movies, tend to be made as a male power fantasy, which is totally fine to have, but I think you need to understand that if you're going to make a male power fantasy, you can't expect a woman to necessarily enjoy that. Whereas if you made a movie that was a female power fantasy, a lot of women would probably enjoy that. One movie that comes to mind is Wonder Woman. Once again, talking about Wonder Woman. A lot of women I know personally really like Wonder Woman, and I'd say that that's kind of a female power fantasy because she's super strong and powerful, but she's also extremely feminine, and that's really awesome to see in media. It just goes to prove that women do enjoy action when it's actually made to appeal to them. A lot of the time too, I've noticed that women tend to not really enjoy the kind of action movies where it's just a bunch of shooty bang bang, cars crashing into things, explosion, that's basically all that's happening. A lot of women, we tend to prefer a narrative to what's happening on screen, which, I guess if preferring a plot in your story is girly, then I guess I'm super girly. There's nothing wrong with liking just a shooty bang bang kind of action movie. There are gonna be girls that like that, but that's not gonna be everybody's cup of tea, because there are plenty of men that I know as well who don't enjoy that kind of action movie. They prefer something with a narrative. Like my husband, for one thing, he definitely likes a narrative. But going back to the female power fantasy, I don't want people to assume that Wonder Woman is the only way that a female power fantasy should look, or that that kind of female power fantasy is going to appeal to every woman that exists. Okay, because it's not. I like watching Wonder Woman, but that's not the kind of female power fantasy that I enjoy. I much prefer Olga from the D&D movie. I think she's really fun. The idea of this big stocky woman just absolutely throwing men around, how she fights with an axe, and she half melts her axe at one point in the movie, and is just looks cooler this way. That's my personal idea of a female power fantasy, because I think it's just fun to just have a woman that's just gonna do stuff that I can't do in reality. That is the point of a power fantasy, because the male power fantasy also is not something that most men can actually achieve. You look at The Rock, and there's a small percentage of men who could look like The Rock, but the rest of men are gonna look more like, I don't know, Peter Parker on average, So that's the whole point of fantasy to begin with, is to just do whatever you want, have fun with it. And as soon as you start throwing arbitrary stupid rules on top of it, that's when you piss me off. Okay, can we just let people have their fantasies, write their stories, have fun with it, without needing to say, no, you can't do that because that's a woman and they need to be weaker than the men. It's shut up, okay? Just shut up. Let me enjoy my fantasy, okay? Let me pretend I can be a cool barbarian lady whacking everything with a great axe, okay? What's the harm in me pretending to do that in fiction? Because I know in reality, I would struggle to swing that great axe even once, okay? I know in reality, if I wanted to be in an action scenario, I'd probably do better as a rogue because I am tiny. Alright, so I had two little loose points that I quickly wanted to touch on before I got to my final point. One of those being that men don't really like to see women getting hurt, which, get over it. Frankly, that's all I have to say, is get over it. Okay, you know what? Adult women are adults naturally, and we don't need you to treat us like children who can't handle getting a little boo-boo, okay? So just stop, okay? No. That's all I'm going to give that particular point. The next little sprinkled point that I wanted to quickly touch on is the idea that men really, really want to see women being sexy. And if they have to look at an unsexy woman, the audacity of that woman to even exist. This tends to be a huge issue. I mean, how many video games have been coming out lately where the main character isn't like some amazingly attractive woman, that she's just like a normal looking person, or she's not a white woman, and they've gotten massive backlash as a result. It's just like, you know, not all women can look like friggin' Angelina Jolie or Scarlett Johansson. Like, some of us look like potatoes most of the time. You know, like, you can show women looking like that. I think it's actually healthy for men to see women who aren't like this perfect image of a woman, because, you know, like, there is an appeal to imperfections. It's hard to see, and I know it might be hard for some men to understand, or people in general to understand, but imperfections are beautiful in their own right. Like, they're what make us who we are. They're what make us unique. A lot of the times when people go and get plastic surgery to make their faces quote unquote perfect, they end up taking away a lot of what makes them unique and special. And it's honestly really sad to see. So can we please just accept the fact that imperfections are okay to have? We don't all need to be perfect movie stars, and not every woman you see in an action film needs to be this amazingly perfect specimen of female beauty. You know, she can just be like a normal looking lady, or she can be a big stocky lady that has more muscles than boobs. Like, what's wrong with that? The only thing that's wrong with that is that you don't want to see it. That's the only thing. And that's not a valid argument. Come at me with a better argument. I guess a better argument could be, well, a character needs to be visually appealing in order for people to care about them, which it's just part of human nature, unfortunately. But maybe you need to change your perception of beauty if you think that a stocky woman is unattractive. So that's all I'm going to give to those 2 points, because they are ridiculous points that I think anyone with a semblance of logic in their brain would hear those 2 points and be like, no, let's not. Alright, on to my final point, finally. You can almost be done listening to my weird voice. I wanted to save this last point because it is kind of the point that I have the most to say on, and it might take me a hot minute to get through everything. It is kind of tying back into the previous point of women are inherently weaker than men, that little segment. This one's kind of expanding on it a little bit more, of the statement of, it takes me out of the story when a woman is super strong and powerful, or can keep up with the men. And, you know, I'd say when it comes to anything written to be in reality, whether that be contemporary or historical, yeah, I'd agree. I think it is a little ridiculous to expect like a little petite woman to be able to throw hands with a bunch of dudes. And that's totally fair. And in that scenario, I do agree with the point that a woman, if she is going to win a fight like that, she needs to have some kind of upper hand that kind of like explains the logic of her managing to succeed against a bunch of bigger, stronger opponents. However, I also feel like this point applies to if there is like a skinny little man trying to beat up like 10 big men. There also needs to be the same level of explanation. It's just like overall, it's just a general rule that's not just for women, it's for basically anyone, is if you are physically weaker than your opponent, there needs to be some other upper hand to give you equal footing. Gender doesn't really matter here. I don't know why it's being applied. I guess it's because of those dumb feminist movies where women are stronger than men without any explanation, which I'm sure there's a couple. I can't really think of any off the top of my head because most of the movies that I watch are not like that, and I do like to have a little bit of logic. However, I do think that women being weaker as a general rule should only apply to reality, or stories that are written in the contemporary world or in like a historical setting. As soon as you enter any form of fantastical reality, whether that be sci-fi, fantasy, superhero, anywhere where you're bending the rules of reality, this rule no longer applies, in my personal opinion. Naturally, in a superhero story, if you want to make your female superhero have super strength, then she's going to be stronger than her male counterpoints. It's the same thing as Superman being able to beat up a bunch of dudes, even though he's only one dude, because he has superpowers. He has an advantage. So I guess to an extent, the superhero does kind of follow the whole, they have an advantage over everybody else. But like a regular person in a superhero setting would still follow like real world rules, unless, I don't know, you're looking at like the My Hero Academia universe where basically everybody has some form of superpower. Or I've heard this theory that in a Marvel universe that a regular person can physically work themselves up to be able to handle the level of scrutiny that a superhero's body needs to be able to handle, right? And then moving into sci-fi, I'd say that it depends on how far into the future you're going. If you're going a couple thousand years into the future, I'd argue that even human women wouldn't be that different from human men at that point. I would imagine that either because of the society that we are right now, we don't care as much about having our women weaker than our men. In my generation, that's not like a huge issue. So I think like if this mentality continues, then the evolution that caused women to be weaker than men might slowly be undone. That, or I think that it is something that a lot of women think about these days, that in 1,000 years, once we've cured everything, like maybe we could figure out some way to boost women's constitution so that they can be on equal footing to men. Because I honestly feel like the biggest way to protect women from dangerous situations that they're put in because of men is to make them physically on equal footing. Because like I'm pretty sure men would be way less interested in trying to hurt a woman if they knew that she could mess him up. Once we start to step into the topic of other races in sci-fi, the whole construct of men versus women breaks down even further. We can look at our own planet as an example of the different species on our planet. That the first thing that comes to mind for me is the female polar bear is always stronger than her male counterpoint, because the male polar bear will try to eat his own children, and so the female polar bear needs to be able to protect against the male to protect the continuation of their species. So what's to say that on an alien world, women having a lower constitution to their male counterpoints simply would not have allowed for the species continuation? Then logically speaking, the females would be equal to their male counterpoints. And what's to say that also that there's like a world out there where the females valued weaker males, and so over thousands of years of evolution, the males became weaker and weaker because that's what the females wanted. The same way that I'm pretty sure that's what happened to humans. Male humans prefer weaker women, and so therefore we are all weaker because they're the ones that got to reproduce. Sliding into the realm of fantasy, I think of orcs. A lot of the ways that orc societies tend to be constructed is they tend to be very warring people that are constantly fighting. Only the strongest survive. And in this society, I personally don't think it makes any logical sense for the female orcs to be smaller than the male orcs. Otherwise, how on earth would they survive? They wouldn't be able to handle the level of abuse that their society puts upon them. It doesn't make sense to me. It does drive me absolutely insane when this is how you choose to characterize your orc society, and then you go and have the female orcs be these little tiny green things. Like, World of Warcraft, I'm looking at you. Anyways, continuing into the fantasy world, also I think of the Rings of Power TV show. I've heard the show is terrible. I have not watched it. It does not look interesting to me. However, there's one critique of the show that I cannot stand by because it is not a proper critique. It is people complaining that Galadriel, a female elf, is able to keep up with the men in her party, which, based on what I previously said, you should already know where I'm going with this, but elves in the Lord of the Rings universe tend to be more or less androgynous. They are magical people who have enhanced their bodies. They've given themselves virtual immortality through magic. So why on earth would the female elves be weaker? Why, even if they started out weak before they started all this magic tampering, why would they voluntarily remain weaker when they can literally give themselves immortality? It doesn't make sense. Okay, I'm sorry. Fantasy is a place where you can have fun. It is a place for you to explore new and interesting ideas of the way that a reality would work that could never work in our reality. You can throw in magic, you can have amazing races, you can have people doing things that you could never even dream of doing in the real world because it's fantasy. And so if someone wants to write a female character in a fantasy setting being just as powerful as her male counterpoints, what's so wrong with that? You're not breaking down the fabric of reality in order to write a fantasy story. You're simply creating your own reality. And at this point, after all my points, if you still try to argue that you don't want to see strong, powerful women fighting in an action scenario, I think that you need to look into yourself and ask yourself why it bothers you so much to see that. Because at that point, there is no logic to defend yourself with. It is simply your opinions, your feelings getting in the way of you being able to enjoy this story. So at the end of the day, if after hearing all of my points, you still don't want to see women in action, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but you are being sexist. That is the only truth that I can fathom. I guess lastly, to add on to it just a little bit, a little side note kind of thing. I do agree with the idea that if you want this female action hero to be able to beat up a bunch of men with her fists, that she probably shouldn't be a petite little 5'2", 130-pound woman. It is important to keep in mind that body type influences the kind of power level that people are going to expect to see from your character. It's the same thing for male characters. Like the rules for male characters should be applied to female characters, and that is one of the issues I think right now, especially in live action media, is the factor that a lot of female action characters tend to be played by really petite women for some reason. It's getting a little bit better once again with Olga. Olga, the actress they chose for her, definitely looked like she could beat up a bunch of dudes. This needs to be applied elsewhere too. If you want to have a man who can lift a house, you're going to make him as big and broad as possible, unless it's supposed to kind of be like a joke, or he's like Spider-Man where, you know, he needs to be thin to look like a spider, but spiders can lift like a certain amount, but like that's an outlier most of the time. Like Superman, he tends to be a big, strong man. Captain America, Batman, all of these male characters who are expected to be strong, fit characters tend to be larger. The same thing needs to apply to women. Maybe in the future, instead of saying women shouldn't be in action, women can't beat up men, maybe we should just take special care to make sure to cast the right women in the right roles. There are plenty of stocky women out there to cast in your stocky women roles. So just keep that in mind when you are coming up with a character design for a female action hero. What kind of fighting style is she going to use, and what body type would make the most sense? And also keeping in mind some comedy. If you wanted to make like a comedy, think about like contradicting character. So like maybe you have this big buff lady that you expect her to like punch a wall, but then she pulls out a spell book and casts like some dainty little spell. You know, that's funny. That's funny, okay? So like just honestly, be more creative, have more fun, allow more diverse body types of female characters. Please, I beg of you. There's more than just skinny 5-foot women out there. Thank you. This has been my TED Talk, I guess. Alright, well, now that my voice is practically dead, and I think I have covered all of the points that I watched and I can remember, I think I can consider this argument to be complete. I am totally open to hearing like if somebody else has another argument that maybe they've heard. Maybe you don't necessarily believe it, but you still would like to like have a debate about whether or not it's true. You know, I'm totally open. I'm totally open to debate. I doubt Shadiversity will ever actually see this, but if he does, you know, I am totally open to having a friendly debate, okay? I don't hate the very ground you walk on. I'm just a bit annoyed with some of the things that you said because I did look up to you for quite a while, and honestly it is super disappointing to see some of the things that you've been saying lately. But he's probably never gonna see this, so I'm talking to a wall, I guess. I don't know. Anyways, if you enjoyed this video, great. If not, I'm sincerely sorry for wasting your time. Thank you anyways for watching regardless. Goodbye.